Welcome to today's webinar presented by MEOPAR and the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum. MEOPAR is a national network that funds marine and coastal research across Canada. Today's topic is, what are peer communities in Canada doing to address coastal hazards and build resilience? Introducing the Resilient Sea online platform. My name is Shari Kotar, and I'm the coordinator for the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum, a community of practice based at the University of Waterloo. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be posted on YouTube for future viewing. The webinar will be about an hour long, including time for questions at the end. If you do have a question for the presenter, please enter it into the Q&A box. Use the chat box if you want to share comments with us and other attendees. Our presenters for today's webinar are Dr. Ryan Reynolds and David Ryder, who will introduce their work in the development and the application of the Resilient Sea online platform. Ryan is a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of Community and Regional Planning at the University of British Columbia. He holds a Master's of Geographic Information Systems and a PhD in Geography from the University of Calgary. David is a Master of Science candidate at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from the University of Massachusetts in 2013. David's research is focused on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Just a quick reminder once again to our audience, please use the Q&A box for presenter questions that will follow the presentation. Use the chat for only other comments. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Ryan and David.
Thanks, Shari. So I'm just going to do a really quick introduction here to myself. I am Dr. Ryan Reynolds, as Shari said, with the School of Community and Regional Planning. If you want to get a hold of me at any time, best way is going to be through email at ryan.reynolds@ubc.ca. David?
Hi everyone, my name is David Ryder. I'm a master's student at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at UBC. And I'll just point out that we are online and connected on social media. If you look over to the bottom right of your screen, you'll see that our website, Twitter handle, and LinkedIn page are listed for you. And we'll also try to share those links with you through the message board.
Yeah, and we also have some other members of our team in the chat today too, so they may be answering some of the questions that we can't necessarily address as well. So we'll just address those to them if that comes up. Just while we're here, we'd also like to extend our thanks not only to the CCRF, but also to MEOPAR, a long-term partner and funding sponsor for the Resilient Sea project over the past 5 years, and to UBC for providing the hosting to make sure that the platform can be public. We'd also like to thank all of the communities that are currently on the platform and have assisted us by completing surveys, responding to emails, and helping us update information as it changes. Just before we get started in on it, we have 2 questions that we're kind of interested in hearing back from you on the audience. The first is, who do you look to for guidance on hazard risk reduction planning? And the second is, when you're exploring possible risk reduction planning actions, which sources would you use to review your options? So if Shari could just share those now, fantastic. And if there's an answer that you would like to provide but isn't on the poll, certainly feel free to put that into the chat. We'll collect that information later on and use it as well. So while you guys are completing those polls, I'm just going to slowly start doing the introduction to the Resilient Sea platform to give you some idea of what that is and how it might be useful to you and your communities or your research programs. So with the longest coastline in the world, Canada is no stranger to coastal hazards. They represent a significant threat to many of our communities, big, small, and in between. With the exceptions of Alberta and Saskatchewan, every single province and territory have at least some exposure to coastal and related natural and human-caused hazards. From reasonably predictable seasonal flooding to the completely unexpected and still unclear changes that may be coming from climate change in specific communities, we know that there are a lot of hazards that communities are having to address today, both in the short and long-term futures. We know that communities look to their peers to determine which risk reduction efforts might be best suited or maybe more effective in addressing hazards risk in their own community. And we know that not all communities in Canada have equal access to human, financial, and technical resources. Small and medium-sized communities in particular may seek guidance from others who face similar conditions or have already taken steps to address specific coastal hazard threats. But the big question is, how do these communities determine who their peer communities are across the country? So who should they be looking to? And how do they discover what those communities have already studied or implemented on their own? And this is where we think that Resilient Sea can help by providing information about community similarity and showing examples of what those communities in our database are doing to address coastal hazards risks. And for some reason, we can't slide forward. There we go. So Resilient Sea is a free online platform that's designed to facilitate knowledge exchange about coastal hazard risk reduction strategies for communities in Canada. The platform works by identifying those communities that share similar hazard profiles or hazard exposures that can be used to identify peer communities from across the country. So we do this by using a set of indicators to assess coastal hazards exposure and the vulnerability or resilience to these hazards. We've also collected data about the actions that these communities have undertaken in order to reduce the risks associated with these hazards, and that usually takes the form of official community planning documents. To answer the question who this is going to be most beneficial for, we believe that anyone that's responsible for disaster risk reduction planning or climate change adaptation planning can benefit from Resilient Sea. Specifically, that includes community planners, engineers, and other community-based disaster management professionals and contractors. Anyone basically working in the fields of disaster risk assessment, climate change adaptation planning, emergency management planning, long or even short-term growth planning. We think that there are four main areas that Resilient Sea can help with community resilience building. And the first of these is in identifying communities across Canada that share those similar hazard exposures and vulnerability profiles we'll be talking about through the rest of today. We believe that it can help you assess the risk reduction activities that other communities have taken, either in the form of technical studies or those that they've implemented in terms of land use planning, damage mitigation, construction guidelines, or more. It is useful as a supporting mechanism for your discussions with key decision makers and, in fact, project funding agencies as well, allowing you to demonstrate what current practice is in Canada, particularly with your peer communities. And for those communities just getting started, it acts as a good foundation of what other communities are doing and what might be of use in your own community. Finally, we believe it encourages the exchange of knowledge between peer communities and assists in building relationships between these communities across the country, allowing them to learn from the experience of their peers, discover best practices, and also, more importantly, sometimes what to avoid. So I keep talking about similar communities or peers, and I kind of want to look at what we're going to do to help you figure out who those people or those communities are. So in Resilient Sea, there are basically three major components that allow us to look at the similarity of different communities. The first of these is on hazard exposure, shown here in the blue circle. This particularly is addressed with 5 hazards that we study, so coastal and riverine flooding, earthquakes, tsunamis, and contaminant spills. We also have a set of indicators that we use to assess different components of communities to build profiles for the communities, shown in pink. And finally, we've collected an extensive set of actions that communities have taken to help reduce risk in their communities. And we assess those based on the types of actions that they've taken, what long-term strategies they're addressing, and at what stage they're in that process, whether that's just early on studies and groundwork, or whether these have actually been implemented. Now, I've talked a lot about these kind of indicators that we're using, and we have a set of 25 hazard vulnerability indicators. These are broken down in Resilient Sea into 5 capitals: economic, social, built environment, natural environment, and institutional. And each of those in turn is broken down into 5 dimensions: size, spatial structure, composition, integration, and generally temporal change. So I'm not going to go through all of the indicators. If they're of interest to you, you can locate them on our website, resilient-c.ubc.ca, and just put a /indicators at the end to locate that specific document. Most of the data that we're acquiring from here comes from data such as the 2016 census, and hopefully in the future, the 2021 census as it comes up. We look at the financial and election reporting that comes from municipalities to their various provinces. We have business location points that allow us to see what businesses are located within communities, what types of businesses they are, and look at kind of how they integrate into that community. We use more traditional GIS layers, such as the digital elevation models, land use and land cover data, to assess how communities are physically structured and how land is being used along the coast. And finally, we've developed some of our own custom geospatial measures that help us to assess communities. Things like how twisty or windy the coastline is, and also how long that coastline is. So in assessing our peers, we've got to turn those 25 indicators into a reasonably meaningful number that's simple and easy to compare between locations. And to do that, we've developed something called the Hazard Vulnerability Similarity Index, or HVSI for short. And basically, this boils down all of the numbers that we have from those 25 indicators into a single number. And a lower number represents less similar communities, shown here in the map in cooler colors. And a higher number, closer to 1, represents warmer colors. And that's shown here on the map, as you can see, mostly on the West Coast for this particular community. We also know that you might not want to focus in on all 25 indicators, but some subset of that. And so our map allows you to filter that down a little bit. So we can start by looking at just the specific capital that you might be interested in, looking at only specific hazards, or just looking at communities that have taken certain actions. And so you can filter that in on our map, which we'll show you in our demonstration shortly. So once you've identified on the map what communities might be similar to yours based on whatever criteria are important to you, we allow you to compare those communities one by one. So for example, in the community of Squamish, we might compare it to Souk, BC. These are both located in BC, one on Vancouver Island, one on the mainland. And their overall similarity is shown in this chart here. The donuts really represent the overall, in this case 0.91, so reasonably similar. The bar chart shows how that breakout is by capital. And if we scroll down a little further into that piece, we can compare each individual indicator for each of the capitals. And I just want to point out one little piece here. You can kind of see these little bars that are in the tables for the two communities. And these represent how those communities compare to our overall data set. So if it's an empty gauge, that means it's on the lower end of our data set. And if it's a full gauge, it's on the high end of the data for that data set. So I'm just going to turn it over here to David, who's going to talk to you about how the actions that communities have taken are being included.
So what risk reduction actions have communities on the platform taken to address coastal hazards? Well, before I answer that, let's talk about what actions are. An action can be any decision or effort that contributes to hazard risk reduction, takes time, money, or other resources, and it must, for our purposes, address one or more of the hazards targeted by the Resilient Sea platform. As Ryan stated, those include coastal flooding, riverine flooding, earthquakes, tsunamis, and contaminant spills. Just to give you an example of what some of these actions may look like, they could be technical studies like a flood mapping exercise, land use regulations like zoning, structural protection measures like seawalls, or construction guidelines for development of floodplain. And where do we find these actions that platform communities have taken? Well, for the most part, we look to official community planning documents, which can come in the form of general community plans or strategies, such as an official community plan, hazard-specific plans like a flood mitigation strategy, or climate and sustainability focused plans like a municipal climate change action plan pictured on the right for Halifax. Then, to understand and track the actions taken by platform communities, we developed an actions framework based on adaptation and hazards literature to best fit the platform and serve our research interests. The framework tracks multiple variables, which include action category, and that's essentially the type of tool used. So that could be land use regulations, which includes things like zoning regulations, construction guidelines, such as building materials or engineering and design standards, technical studies like reports or flood risk mapping, emergency preparedness, which are steps to prepare for and respond to emergencies, capacity building, which could be the hiring of staff or formation of committees, financing and insurance, which could be flood insurance or allocating funds for adaptation, and lastly, an other category for policy and planning, which could be the creation of a general strategy or plan. Then we look at the action stage, which distinguishes between groundwork or steps that lay the foundation for change and implementation, which involves direct changes to reduce risk. So an example of groundwork would be preparing a flood risk assessment, and implementation would be creating and enforcing a new land use bylaw around development and floodplain. Finally, we track the long-term strategy, which mostly applies to actions that have a distinct long-term approach for addressing the impacts of climate change, often specifically in response to sea level rise. So most of you are probably familiar with the first 4 strategies there highlighted in yellow, which are protect, retreat, accommodate, and avoid. Protect is steps to prevent hazards and their impacts, which could be through structural protection such as seawalls. Retreat is any strategic decision to withdraw, relocate, or abandon assets. Accommodate allows the hazard to occur but reduces its impact. So an example would be allowing development in a flood-prone area, but regulating how that development takes place. And then avoid, which is ensuring that development does not take place in at-risk areas. Our actions collection methodology has involved a full team effort that included developing a coding scheme and guidebook, testing for intercoder reliability to ensure that action collection and coding is consistent regardless of who is completing the task. And then we have multiple research assistants collecting actions data from public source documents from all of our platform communities across Canada. Provide you with a quick example of what an action looks like on Resilient Sea. Here we have an example community of Wolfville, which is a town of about 4,000 on the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia. One of the source documents we'd use for Wolfville is the Regional Municipal Climate Change Action Plan. An action that we pull out of there is a requirement for a minimum first floor elevation for new buildings in a flood zone. We categorize that as a construction guideline. The action stage is implementation because it constitutes a direct change in local policy to reduce risk. And then the long-term strategy is accommodate because it is allowing development to occur in hazardous area through changes made to reduce the impacts of potential flooding. So how is all this useful to our platform communities? Well, by learning what similar communities are doing to address coastal hazards, you can compare strategies and progress to your peers. You can gain insight and inspiration from the actions of other leading communities. You can access public source documents to learn more about the context and implementation of those actions. And then you can use those examples of other communities as leverage for political buy-in in your own planning process. And finally, you can connect with counterparts to share knowledge and experience. So we now have an actions database of over 1,600 actions, which provides a good snapshot of how action is taking place across coastal Canada. As an example, here's a breakdown of actions by action category across all of our platform communities in 4 provinces. If you look at the chart, you see that the most common actions so far have been technical studies, which again includes things like mapping exercises, risk assessments, or the preparation of one-time reports. And that's followed by land use regulations and then damage mitigation, which could be measures like structural protection. This data can also help answer future research questions, for example, around the relationship between actions taken and the community type and vulnerability, or how actions may change over time. So to give you another example, here's a breakdown of applicable actions by long-term strategy. And we see that currently the vast majority of actions fit into protect or accommodate, whereas much fewer are considered avoid, and there have been very few actions that could be considered retreat. So I'm going to pass it back over to Ryan now.
Okay, so let's just go straight into a demo, which is always smart to do on a live presentation. So this is the new and updated version of Resilient Sea's front page. There are a couple of different pieces that are here to allow you to start looking at new communities. You can search in our quick bar up in the top right, click the selected community, but I'm going to choose this menu on the left-hand side. Depending on the size of the screen that you're using, this might look slightly different. It might just be compressed down for smaller screens, but we do definitely recommend using larger screens when using Resilient Sea. So I'm just going to click on select a new community, and that's going to give us a map that shows all of the communities in our database as markers on this map. Now, there's only communities right now in 4 provinces. We're hoping to expand that. We'll be talking about that later. But I did want to kind of highlight that there are 2 different ways to select a community. You can just click on a community's marker on the map, and that will work just fine. Or we can use the chat bar, the search window here to kind of pull that down. If you've already been on the site and looking before, you'll see that at the top we have your most recent searches, and you can just enter in the name of a new place that you'd like to search. So I'm going to enter in Digby because that's a community I'm interested in Nova Scotia. And as I start with DIG, I see that Digby appears. There's 2 of them. There's the town and the district. And I just want today the town. So we're going to click on that one. So this brings us to the community profile for the town of Digby. And as you can see, it is located in Nova Scotia down here. And on the left-hand side, you have quick actions that you can take to see specific information about the community of Digby. So I'm going to just click on hazards exposure to bring that piece up here. I haven't really talked about this a lot, but most of our hazards exposure data right now is concentrated in BC just because of the history of the project. And we're going to be expanding that out to the eastern coast a little bit better in the future. But we do have some hazard exposure information for Digby already. We can see that they are exposed to coastal flooding in that community, and they've taken at least 5 actions to address coastal flooding. Our data set isn't sure about riverine flooding, but we can see that they have taken action, so it's reasonable to assess that they have some risk at least to riverine flooding. We see that they're not exposed to earthquake risk, and they're also not exposed to tsunami risk, but contaminant spills is likely. So if we just scroll down that profile page, we can see the individual similarity indicator values that are in these boxes here. And you can just use the tabs to circle through the different capitals for those if you'd like. And then down below here is the community actions data that our students have been collecting for the community of Digby. David, you're kind of the expert here. Can you kind of go through what we have for Digby?
Yeah, so for Digby, in terms of actions that address coastal flooding, we see that so far there are 5, which have been limited to capacity building and technical studies. And if you look at some of those listed there, there's actions like preparing flood maps and risk assessments. And importantly, these are all considered groundwork actions, which again are steps that inform and prepare stakeholders for action, but do not constitute actual changes in policy or programs. So clearly the town of Digby is early on in the planning process with still much work to do.
Okay, so that's great. Digby can use Resilient Sea to try and find other communities that are going to have information that might be of use to them based on their own experiences. So I'm going to play matchmaker and use find similar communities to find a match or maybe more for the community of Digby. So it does take a second just to crunch through all the numbers here, and then this brings up that similarity map I showed you in the presentation a little earlier. So as we can see, the communities that are less similar are shown here in blues and dark blues, and the more similar communities are in the light and darker oranges and into the reds. And we can use the zoom tool to just zoom in on specific regions that we might want, say New Brunswick, or maybe even further into Nova Scotia. And we look here, you can see this is the town of Digby shown in black, and the communities around it tend to be reasonably similar, which makes a lot of sense. But we're trying to see across Canada what might be a good match for Digby. And let's say that we're in particular interested in just coastal hazards. So if I go over to the map filter on the right-hand side, I'll click on filter by hazards exposure, and I'm just going to pick coastal only for the moment. I'm also really interested more in land use regulations, so I'm going to click the checkbox next to that one as well. And that's just going to limit it to communities that have already taken some form of land use regulation. All right, with those in place, I'm going to apply that filter. Wait a moment while Resilient Sea crunches those numbers for us. And we'll see a new map showing that similarities. And you're going to see a lot of this light gray color, especially out east, where we're missing some of that hazard vulnerability information. But if we look over here in British Columbia, where we have much better hazards data, you can see that we have a few communities that do stand out, that meet both of our criteria. They have addressed coastal hazards, and they have also some form of land use planning initiatives. And it's Gibson's that really stands out in red here for us, not so much maybe for Port Moody over here in blue. Gibson's has an HVSI value, that number I talked about earlier, of 0.86. And basically for our purposes, any value above 0.8 is deemed to be similar, and above 8.5 is deemed to be very similar. So I'm going to click on Gibson's to kind of bring that piece together. And now we can do a one-to-one comparison between the town of Digby, located in Nova Scotia, and the town of Gibson's over in BC. So on the left-hand side, we have some quick links. So I'm just going to jump down to overall similarity. And here we can see that in this donut chart, that overall similarity, as I said earlier, is 0.86, very similar. And we can see the breakdown by each of the 5 capitals that we have. And with the exception of economic here, they're all above that 0.8 level, which is really good. So I'm just going to focus in on that economic capital for a second to see where those differences might lie, because maybe they're important and maybe they're not for us. So each of the 5 indicators in this capital are shown here, along with their individual values for Digby on the left and Gibson's here on the right. And we can also see their magnitude. So again, this is where they fall within our overall data set. Lower values on that magnitude scale are indicated of lower values in our overall data set, and vice versa for higher values. So when we compare median household income for the town of Digby and Gibson, we can see that Digby's really on the low end here, and Gibson's is still low, but it's a lot higher than it was before. And that gives us an HVSI of about 0.69. Conversely, if we look at businesses in the coastal zone, and this is the percentage of businesses located within 500 meters of the shore, we see that almost all of Digby's businesses, about 88%, are located in that region, whereas in Gibson's, it's closer to 50%. And that gives us a score of 0.6. So that's maybe not so similar. I'm just going to zoom down here to institutional capital on the left-hand side, which is this dark purple down here. And we can see that these values are a lot more similar just by looking at the magnitude values, but also if we explore the individual values and the HVSI value. So revenue per capita, pretty similar across the board. Critical infrastructure in the zone, both have roughly 50% in that zone. And everything's roughly the same until we start looking down here at transfer payments. Transfer payments may be not so high in Digby, and they are higher in Gibson's. And then we have NA down here at the bottom. And that indicates that we have some missing data in our data set for political turnover for the town of Digby. That just means that our students haven't yet collected that information and brought it in. So when it goes into the HVSI, it just ignores that piece and it handles it without any problems. So overall, it looks like Gibson might be a really good place to look to learn more about what kinds of actions they've taken that Digby might be able to learn for. So I'm just gonna click on the Gibson's link here, and that's gonna bring us to the community profile for Gibson's BC. Because it's in the BC and it's one of our original communities, we have really great hazards exposure data for it. We can see it is vulnerable to all 5 of the hazards that we have, including coastal and riverine flooding. And it is a little bit at risk from earthquakes, so it's ranking a 2 out of 5 for that, a 2 out of 4 for tsunami risk, and a 4 out of 5 for contaminant spill risk, so that's maybe not so good. You can also see that they have taken actions for all of these hazards. So I'm really interested to see what they have done down there. So I'm just going to zoom straight to that. And that brings up the community actions piece. So get David to talk a little bit more about this for us.
For Gibson's, we have many more, a total of 12 actions that address coastal flooding, many of which come in the form of land use regulations, which is something we were interested in, such as coastal setbacks and land designations to prevent further development, as you can see in some of those examples listed. And in contrast to Digby, these actions are considered implementation, meaning they've moved past the groundwork stage to deliver tangible changes to their local policies to reduce risk. So for Digby, as a similar and similarly vulnerable community, they may benefit from learning more about the steps that Gibson's has taken to address the risk of coastal flooding in their community and what their experience has been. So to facilitate that process and the knowledge sharing component of the platform, the interested party in Digby can access the public source document for these actions via the link on the side there, which, if it works, should take us over to Gibson's official community plan. And then you can scroll through, you can actually find where some of these actions are listed in this document and learn more about the context or the specific ways these actions were implemented in their community. If we return back over to the profile page, at the very bottom, you'll see that the contact information for relevant, often the most knowledgeable municipal representative from that community is listed, which can enable you to make that connection for more information and to share experiences. And at the very bottom, there will also be a link to the municipality's website where there will be likely more information or other contacts. And I'll just note that if you are using the platform and notice that actions are missing from your community's profile page, please contact us. Or if the contact info is missing or needs updating, let us know that as well. So as Ryan navigates out of here, I'll help give you a quick review of how communities can use the Resiliency platform to help find a resilience network partner. So platform communities can follow these steps. The first one being that you can use the map or search bar to select from over 150 communities currently on Resiliency. Then on the Find Similar Communities page, you can use map filters to narrow down communities most likely to peers to your own or to a reference community of choice. You can then explore the similarity of the two communities overall by capital or the level of individual indicators. And on that community's profile page, you can explore the risk reduction actions that they have taken to address hazards that may be affecting your own community. You can follow those links to review the public source documents and learn more about how your peers have addressed hazard threats already and look at what they're planning to do next. And finally, you can use the contact information at that bottom of the community profile page to connect with counterparts to share knowledge and experiences.
Yeah, so it's like 6 simple steps to get through and figure out what's going on in other communities. That works. So that's the Resiliency platform as it sits today. It is a beta just right now as we're relaunching and trying to figure some new fixes out for the bugs that we've just encountered. So it was released, I think, on Monday, so it is fresh. But I do want to also talk about where we're going in the future, what our roadmap is for resiliency, at least in the short and medium terms here. And it's doing that again. There we go. There are 4 basic areas that are basically on our roadmap right now. The first is geographic expansion, which is a continuing process for us. Looking to update our hazard exposure modeling, looking at a user interface improvements and review of what the site is right now. And then finally, looking at improving our community outreach, particularly for the communities already on the site. So that first set, geographic expansion, with each major release, we've tried to add new communities from new regions of the country. The initial set was 50 communities in BC. We then expanded with 54 communities in Nova Scotia, and we introduced our first Indigenous community with Musqueam in BC. And with this recent release this week, we now have communities in Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick added to our data set. For our next release, we're hoping to add communities in Newfoundland and possibly Labrador as well. And we're exploring the following areas for the future. That would be Ontario, Quebec, and expanding our Indigenous community representation in Resilient Sea. I talked a little bit about this before, but we're definitely going to be updating the hazards exposure model right now. It is limited to those original 50 communities in BC with a few little updates here and there. But we want to take this national and look at earthquake vulnerability, possibly tsunami vulnerability, and coastal flooding across the country, just to make it easier for us to do those community comparisons across the country. And we expect to see that in our next major update, hopefully. As we look a little bit further down the road, we're going to be conducting a usability assessment of the platform over the fall and into kind of early 2021 as we get that data back. And if you'd be interested in participating in that, we'd absolutely love to hear your feedback. You could just send it to resilient.coast@ubc.ca. And what we're basically looking at is, does the application meet your needs and is it quick and easy to use? And finally, for what's coming next, we're going to be connecting with the platform communities to help them learn more about Resilient Sea and how it can help them, and to identify areas where the platform might be of greater assistance and updates that we could make to make it better for you. We expect this to be completed throughout 2021. And again, if you're interested in participating, please just send us an email, resilient.coast@ubc.ca. And those links will be at the end as well. So at the very beginning of this, we asked you two questions, and I'm wondering if we could just bring up those polls now so we can see what those results look like. So for the first question, who do you look to for guidance on hazard risk reduction planning? We can see that a lot of you are looking at academic researchers, about 75%, with then federal and provincial governments as kind of the second in line, which is about what I would expect to see. I'm actually a little surprised academic researchers are that high up there. And then we have a decent split amongst most of the other pieces. But it looks like international municipalities, maybe not so high, and across Canada could use a little work. So maybe Resilient Sea can help with that piece there. And then if we look at question number 2, when exploring possible risk reduction planning actions, which sources you would use to review your options, it looks like number 1, we have a tie between provincial or federal guidance and the academic literature and or case studies from our sample, highly scientific poll here today. You've seen it now. So this is kind of giving us an idea of where you're looking for that information, and that'll help us to figure out who we need to contact in the future and what areas we should be addressing on the site as we kind of go forward. So I'm just going to basically close it out right here. As David mentioned at the beginning of this, we do have 2 social media accounts, one on Twitter and LinkedIn. We have our own email address, I've already said several times, but resilient.coast@ubc.ca. And if you'd like to get started with Resilient Sea today, all you have to do is go to resilient-c.ubc.ca. So on behalf of myself and our other people in the chat, and also for David, we'd like to really thank you today for participating in the webinar, and we look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much for your presentation, Ryan and David. We do have some questions coming in, so just a friendly reminder, if you do want to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A chat and we can get some of the presenters to address them. So the first question that an attendee has pointed out is Resilient Sea able to summarize ongoing data collection by communities collecting and publishing long-term tests?
Are we able to summarize that? Well, yes and no. So once the data becomes public, so once they're published in official planning documents and we go through and collect that information, it does get integrated in, but we're not necessarily looking at how many any individual community has completed in maybe their ongoing process. David, do you want to fill in a little more there?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. We haven't begun any work on summarizing information for individual communities, but we are continuously working to build out that profile page and have some ideas to make it have sort of a measuring stick feature to show what types of actions may be the focus in that community, and you'd be able to use that to compare to other ones as well.
Yeah, and I just encourage, if you have feedback that would be helpful to yourselves in improving that page, just shoot us an email and let us know what it looks like, and we'd be happy to hear it.
Perfect, great. I think the next question is more so a comment and a question. As the platform is largely dependent on frequent updates and maintenance, from a cost-benefit analysis standpoint, do you see the benefits of this tool outweighing the costs of creating and maintaining it?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a very labor-intensive process in terms of the data collection, both for the indicators and for the actions data that we collect. But it's not just the platform that's being used. We also have research that's underlying this that is being supported by Resilient Sea. And its benefits are not just for UBC and our own team, but it's also for the various communities that we work with and as part of our outreach program.
Perfect, thanks. We have another attendee that's asking if the tool will always be free or will it transition to a paid out model in the future?
That's a really great question. We haven't really talked about super long-term future, but right now the platform is free and we intend it to be free. It is funded largely through MIAPAR. And as long as funding is available, we're happy to keep working on the platform and continuing that to be free going forward. But these are uncertain times and I don't know where the long-term future is going to be, but it is a research project and I'm pretty sure we can maintain that for at least the next couple of years.
Great. How do you view the actualization of information, for example, contact information, links to documents over the long term when you might not be personally involved in the platform?
Yeah, and we don't necessarily want to be personally involved in doing that, but what we are hoping is that communities will find one another on the site and start building their own little networks of resilience, whether that's local or whether that's across the country. But I think that there's really opportunities for the communities themselves to get involved and to do that learning. So the actualization isn't happening, say, with David or I kind of working with communities. It's with the communities finding the information themselves and turning that into information that they integrate into their long-term planning.
Awesome. We still have a few more questions. Are there any plans on determining the efficacy of actions taken in communities to further qualify best practices in disaster risk reduction?
Yeah, that's a great question. David, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, similar to a point Ryan just made a moment ago, it's the value of the platform is really in building these connections between different communities. And our role here is not to determine the efficacy of actions or really even to make recommendations as to what actions are going to be best suited for your community. We're just providing a resource to connect with other communities that may be similar to your own and similarly vulnerable, and use the platform to facilitate the knowledge sharing between these communities to learn from others how their experience has been with certain actions, whether they've seen benefits from it yet, or whether that is expected further in the future, costs, what it took to get the political buy-in, and so on and so on. That's the kind of information that we're hoping communities that are using the platform can share with each other to help benefit the planning process and implementation of risk reduction in others.
Yeah, I don't think we're necessarily trying to build a set of best practices. I don't think it's necessarily the responsibility of academics to dictate that to communities. But I do think that what we're able to do is kind of show what the state of practice is today amongst communities, or at least today as it was when we collected that data. And I think that that in and of itself is a useful tool for communities.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to give one last call out to the participants to see if there are any last questions that want to be answered. Is the sole source of data on the indicator census data? I think you might have mentioned this. If you want to just take another stab at it, Ryan.
Yeah, I did address this a little earlier on, but some of the data certainly is coming from the 2016 census. So things like household income, total population, housing value, those sorts of things. But we're also pulling in data from municipal reports to their provinces for elections and financial reporting. We're bringing in business data that's looking at business location data across the country. So that's something like 1.7 million business points. We have traditional GIS layers like digital elevation models, land use and land cover layers. And we also have a few of our own in there. And so if you go to resilient-c.ubc.ca/indicators, there's information about where those indicators are coming from. And that section's a little slight right now. So I'm hoping in our next expansion or our next update, we'll be able to provide a lot more information about where that data is sourced from. We just kind of ran out of time. So hopefully in a near update, we'll have where that data is coming from and links directly to the source data for that.
Great. And I have the last two questions and then we'll wrap up the presentation. Is it possible to mine the data example by adaptation action on the platform itself?
Is it possible to, sorry, mine the data?
Filter it. I think someone's asking if you could filter it by, specifically by climate action data.
We can. Let me just jump back to the original screen here. So if we go to the Find Similar Communities, there are limits on specifically what we're looking at. So the hazards exposure currently doesn't specifically include climate hazards. That's something we can certainly look at in the future, and we'd love to hear that suggestion. But it does look at different approaches that are being taken in terms of the actions that are done, and some of those are more kind of climate related than others. For example, construction guidelines, maybe not so much, whereas land use a bit more. So no, it's not possible to necessarily do it for climate, but that's certainly an area we could look at in the future. And I think that there's enough interest, then we'll definitely go in that direction.
Great. And then the last question would be, any plans of making a French version? I know you guys have stated that Quebec is on your radar for future studies, but is there plans of making a French version of the platform?
Yeah, I'm not going to commit and say that next week there'll be a French version, but it's certainly something that's been on our radar pretty much since I joined the project. And I think that it's an area that we would like to see, that if funding is available and we're able to move into Quebec, that would be a mandatory piece, would be to include that. It does in many ways kind of double the amount of work that we're doing for each document that comes in. It needs to be translated, although a little bit of that did occur as we moved into New Brunswick here as well. So many of those source documents were in French and we had to translate those as well. So it is definitely on the radar. And I think if there's interest, we're absolutely interested in bringing that forward. I think we would need some partnerships there in Quebec or elsewhere to kind of help us through that process. But it's certainly something that we'd like to see.
Great, thank you. That will wrap up the Q&A with that last question. So thank you everyone for your great questions. I want to thank once again our presenters Ryan Reynolds and David Ryder for their fantastic information-filled presentation. If you're interested in learning more about the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum, please visit our website at uwaterloo.ca/Canadian-coastal-resilience or contact myself at scottar@uwaterloo.ca. I'll write it in the chat as well if anyone wants to shoot me an email after. We will be sending out a link to the recording in a follow-up email within the next week, so look out for that. And once again, I'd like to thank our presenters from the Resiliency team. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar presented by Meopart and the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.